Hi, and welcome to the Practical Ascension podcast. I'm your Practical Ascension guide, Tracy Goody, and welcome to this Catalyst podcast series. Recently, I have contributed to a collaborative project. It's a multimedia magazine called Catalyst. So in this 2023 issue, we focused on awakening your inner change creator. This magazine is for you if you identify as someone who is here to persevere and really create change, to connect into your soul truth and make things better. In this magazine, I am joined by 12 co-creators, all of whom are anchored in their soul truth and mission in their own way. Really, really powerful contributors. So in this series, I will be interviewing some of these fellow contributors so that you can get to know them and get a vibe for their brilliance that they bring to the world and to this project. You can get your copy of Catalyst magazine at the link in the show notes below. Today, I'm joined by Holly McLoughlin. Holly is a work-life coach who inspires mission-driven work lives that are better for people and the planet. Her passion is for creating experiences and deeply connecting to your authentic self, accepting all of who you are and what you've been through so that you can tune in to what you really want to be experiencing in your work life and begin to thrive spiritually as well as practically. So welcome, Holly, to the Practical Ascension podcast. I'm so excited to speak with Holly today. She's a new connection for me. We are collaborators on Catalyst magazine, and we share a lot of very similar views about connecting with yourself and connecting with aspects of yourself. So welcome, Holly. I'm so happy to have you on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Tracy. It's lovely to be here.
I love it. So one of the things that I really resonate with you on is your view of looking at the whole self, not just looking at, the sparkly and the lovely, fun aspects of self, but really integrating all of it together. I'd love to hear a little bit about why that is important to you and where that kind of flows from for you.
Okay, so for me, it flows from my personal life story.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in an underprivileged background, quite a poor background, trauma, unintentional neglect, I would say, on multiple levels, physical, mental, emotional, and so on. And really, what I found as I grew older was that I didn't have a very good sense of who I am as a person. I think when you go through major challenges at a young age, it delays some of our development in terms of knowing what we like, what we don't like, what our opinions are, who we are. So we have to build that sense of self. And when we've had particularly adverse experiences, it can be really hard to give ourselves permission to connect in with that. And so for me, that's been an incredible gift because I found my way through this and I've been able to share that with the people that I work with. Often my clients are people who have really faced all different kinds of adversity and all different kinds of barriers in their life, but we find those common threads, those universal stories. And we very much work to understand how we embrace both the light and the dark in our story. I'm a big believer that some of the older ways of being in the world around, we need to be good, we need to be light, trying to be worthy, trying to be lovable, trying to be enough.
Yeah, trying to be, trying. Yeah,
that's it. It takes us away from our authenticity.
Yeah.
And sometimes we need to go to the shadowy places, to what's sometimes called what I like to call the fertile void, because it's a space where it's unknown, it's dark, it's scary. Often we don't want to go there because it might be painful and we don't know how to process those experiences.
Yeah.
And we've usually made up all kinds of stories. We're great at making up meanings as human beings. And sometimes those stories we're not the most accurate storytellers. I'm not, you're not.
Yeah.
We all look through various lenses and we don't even realize they're there. So I help people to not just find a new perspective, but to interpret their life story in a way that empowers them.
I love that. And the way, like, whenever you're speaking about it and kind of what we learned from early in life and how that shapes us right now, really what was jumping out to me was just like you said, like making sure that we're liked, making sure we're accepted, kind of that people pleasing takes over the narrative of who we are, who we have to be. And it sounds like you're really digging into, like you said, like that void, that darkness, in order to bring out the empowerment that's actually in there, in order to bring out who we really are and reconnect into those aspects of self. So this energy of empowerment seems really connected like into the void area. I would love to know, like, I know for myself, that would be something that, like, previously, you know, I don't really want to go too much into those heavy emotions at the start of like my spiritual journey. At this point, I love it. Like that's my jam. I love getting into the depths of things. And when I'm working with somebody and they're like, letting me know experience they're going through, a challenge they're going through, and these big emotions, I'm like, yay! I'm like celebrating because I know what's on the other side of that for them. Do you find kind of like a similar energy that you've gone from working through your own stories and programs, that kind of it leads into the light?
Yeah, so two things. First of all, I would say the story that I create around light and shadow,
Yeah.
that I don't think the shadow really exists. I think it's so often a broken lens or a coloured lens that we're looking for that makes us feel alone, lonely, desperate, helpless, hopeless, you know, enraged even. So that's just a little nuance, because I think it's really important to recognize that when we're talking about shadow, darkness, heavy sensations and experiences, we are creating that within ourselves. And it's not to say that, and I say this through a trauma-informed lens, so I just want to be clear in case any listeners have been through some really awful experiences. You know, I used to listen to a lot of talks and think, oh, well, that person, that they've obviously never been through anything as hard as I have, you know? And so I can say that the darkness doesn't exist. It's holding on to an identity that isn't us, that created it. And so when you say, have I been through a journey with emotions? 100% yes. I think that there is a collective story, and it plays out massively in society today, that tells us in words sometimes, tells us in body language, tells us in very subtle messages at times, it's not safe to feel that. Whatever that is for you, whatever that scary place is. And we tend to talk about emotions like as if love is light and as if despair is darkness. But in reality, love can be one of the scariest and darkest places to go.
Absolutely, yeah. It depends on the story, right?
And exactly, and despair can be a place that is totally comfortable for us because it's what we know. And so part of personal development and personal growth is about recognizing that every emotion is a spectrum. And we want to have full access to the spectrum. It's not about being all light or all dark, all happy or all sad. It's about being able to be with the reality of your life experience in its fullness without that energy getting stuck in you. So often when we have an emotion that we are afraid of being with or going to, the reason we're afraid is because we don't know how to process it. And let's be honest, if you're going to put your attention on something that feels awful, yucky, sticky, trapped to you, if you then don't know what to do with it, that is terrifying.
If you think you're going to be stuck in it, if you think that's who you are.
Exactly. So I think there's definitely a need for us to learn how to be with our emotions safely and to know how to then process them. And some of that is what I like to call emotional fluency. So it's having the language of emotions. Most of us have, when we talk about our emotions, we have a very limited range of words that we use. And when we can expand that range of the emotions, I use something, and you can search for this, you know, if any listeners are curious. There's a blog on my website on it as well. But if you type in tiers of emotion, it just gives you 21 different frequencies of emotion, and it gives you the words you can use. Mm-hmm. And then the next stage is you can learn to interpret emotions. So one of my favorites was, I used to be super angry, and anger was like, again, another collective story here is feeling angry is bad. It makes you a bad person. Mm-hmm. Or it makes you an angry person when we attach it to our identity, but it's not our identity. It's just an experience we're having.
Exactly.
There's a big difference between feeling angry and acting behaviorally angry, as in, you know, violence and things like that. Mm-hmm. But it's a really healthy emotion because it's about boundaries. So this amazing phrase, and it's not my phrase. I learned it from some of my teachers, and it's, you know, anger is a natural response to a boundary being crossed. So every emotion has a meaning behind it like this. And when we can let ourselves acknowledge that we have a certain feeling, fear was one that we all have kind of a blind zone. It's like the emotion that we don't want to admit that we have. So being fearful was an emotion I didn't want to feel. And for a long time, it was something I couldn't name. I was like, no, I'm not feeling that. I'm just angry.
Yeah, because it's like the underneath one. That's something else I look at as well. It's like there's that first emotion, but then what's that emotion protecting? Which is like what, you know, I'd often see anger is there because it's protecting something else underneath of it.
Yeah. And I would add to the conversation on emotion is early on in the journey, it's about moving towards the pain, because that's where the trapped energy is. That's the thing that's keeping us blocked. And what we tend to do is tell a big story. And it tends to be, we have three types of stories that we tell. We have what's called a victim story, which is where we're helpless, everything's against us, there's no point in even trying, because no matter how hard we try, you know, nothing's going to change.
Everything's going to be the same. Yeah.
And then we have what's called a overcoming story. And this is kind of like a false strategy to get the love and the acceptance and the worthiness that we all, and belonging that we all crave as social beings. And that story is one where we kind of tend to go into something around overwhelm and blame, or frustration and confusion, or any kind of emotion that feels transitional, where there's this tug of war and you don't know which way is up and down. You don't know, is it me, is it them? Is it me or the situation? And generally we've kind of created strategies that are attempting to get us the emotional experience we want, but we're not really ever going to get it with that strategy when we're in an overcoming story. And then we have a great story, which is like flow. I might not be there yet, but I'm totally on my journey. I feel like I'm in the right place at the right time. And so one of the ways to bring yourself out of those stories that keep us trapped is to not tell a story, but to name the emotions that need acknowledging in that story, because stories carry our emotional content. They also carry our meaning. So they do have value in terms of how we connect with our sense of self. The story we tell about ourselves is our identity. But the emotions in the early stage is usually the thing that we need to admit that we're having, because that's a true experience for you. And one of the things that keeps us stuck so often is we think, oh, I'm not allowed to feel that because we have that experience at some other past point. People talk about childhood, but it happens in adulthood as well.
Yes.
And those emotions need to be felt and acknowledged, basically.
What guidance would you give as kind of like a first step for somebody who recognizes that, you know, it's going to be really impactful for them to look at emotions, but are almost feeling kind of like they've shut that off, but they are interested and they do feel the value in it. They feel drawn to do it. What guidance would you give to him as like a first step to get back into that space, reconnect into that space?
Great question. Yeah. I think this was something I really struggled with actually, and I know a lot of people do. There's no perfect first step. You know, life is not necessarily linear.
Yeah.
But I think one of the breakthrough moments for me was when I realized that in some of my life experiences, I was not letting myself admit how I really felt about those events or those circumstances. Because I had this story that meant it made me a bad person.
Yeah.
Your version of it might be it makes you unlovable, it makes you unworthy, you have no value is another common one.
That's my favorite one. Yeah.
I'm undeserving, it can come out as, you know, we have all these variations on around it. And when you realize that in any experience, your emotional response to it is always true and valid.
Yeah.
But we doubt that.
Yeah.
And the reason we doubt it is because someone else will say, well, I didn't feel that way. Or why are you feeling that way?
Yeah.
And what we have to learn is that two people can go through the exact same experience, the exact same circumstances, and they will both have a different experience.
Yeah.
Even though the environment and the container is identical. So, and that's because every single one of us is unique, both spiritually and scientifically.
Yeah.
Our DNA is never the same. The way our brain is wired is never the same. It's completely unique. So your lens on the world will be completely unique to every experience you have.
Yeah.
So when we can allow ourselves to say, it's okay for me to have a different emotional experience than what other people said, then we can start to claim our story as our own. We can start to write our own story or author our own narrative because we haven't got these blocks. Because obviously, if we don't agree with other people and they say, well, you shouldn't feel that, we lose our sense of connection.
Yeah.
We're always looking for connection.
And that so it feels like very much like you're going into a space of validating yourself, but letting your nervous system be in a state where it is relaxed and you're feeling that connection so that you're feeling safe to actually look at it and validate it and really open up that space. But I think that's a really good perspective to look at it from is, you know, I had this experience and that's valid. Somebody else had the same experience. They experienced it differently. They have a different story around it, and that's valid. Like everybody's story is valid. Just like you said, everybody's their own perspective, their own person, completely different. But validating yourself instead of that need for receiving that external validation for your emotions, I think that's a really powerful first step because that can really open up this space for you. Then the floodgates might start, then, you know, things might start opening up a bit more. But when you give yourself that permission, I think that's a really powerful step. Like that feels like a lot of heart chakra opening. Like, oh my God, I'm actually allowed to feel this way. I'm actually allowed, you know, to do this. It isn't right or wrong. It doesn't mean that I'm unworthy, undeserving, or a bad person. Like that's a really powerful step, I think. Yeah. I'm in the process of writing a book with 4 other coaches at the moment. We meet every week for what we call a resiliency circle, where we meet and we just name our emotions. We don't give any story and we just hold space for that. And it's so validating when someone else says, oh yeah, I've had a bit of that this week. Yes.
And when we're allowed to have a cocktail of emotions, like we think we have to feel one thing or the other. It's really normal to feel hope and hopelessness at the same time. To feel kind of excitement and worry at the same time. You know, and we feel like we have to pick one. And so often the paradox is like, we can feel it all. It can be there. And interestingly, we haven't named the book yet, but we keep talking about permission slips.
Yeah.
And how the first step is always giving yourself permission.
Yeah.
After that, it becomes learn to name what you're feeling. What I can tell you is I had a really hard time with this. I was so frustrated. I was trying to journal on questions like, when I was a kid, how did it feel to be around X parent or such and such a person? How did it feel for you? And I genuinely couldn't find the words. So if that's happening for anyone else, I would say definitely journal on how it makes you feel to not know, because that's what can open it up. It's just, and again, for some of us, if we don't have a strong connection between our body and our mind, journaling doesn't work. Go for a walk and voice record it on your phone, because your brain will make different connections that way.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree with that. So something else that I wanted us to look at it while we're in this space is, so we're looking at emotions and we're looking at kind of getting into those spaces, giving ourselves that permission, opening that up. As we're doing that, is there a particular kind of flow that we can look at? Like, what moves us from recognizing that emotion, validating it, but then moving over to maybe incorporating it into who we are, or moving into more so empowerment? Like, what will be the connection there?
I think that there are many different techniques. In all honesty, I know there are some practitioners out there who'll say, this is the way and the only way. And there's certain practitioners who are like, oh, you shouldn't hop from one to another. I believe that different horses for different courses.
Yeah.
So we do have to play with different things. But one of the processes that's been really helpful for me, and it's really simple, is, let's say and this is what I've written about in my catalyst in the magazine that we're in, is how do you actually begin to do that process? So for me, noticing how an emotion shows up for you matters. So what I found through research is that it shows up differently for all of us depending on where on our journey we're at. So in the early days, sometimes, and I say this in the early days as a gross generalization, it may not happen this way for everybody, but it tends to be that we notice a repeating thought. We know we're in a cycle or a loop. But we're not necessarily in tune with the emotion. The thinking is kind of rattling away and spiraling. So the way that we notice our emotions is through what I call the 5 bodies, and this comes from yoga. It's a model. So, the Sanskrit version is called the 5 koshas, or the 5 layers of being. And the idea is that we have our core being, our authentic self, our soul or true self, that is at the core of us. And it's surrounded by all of these layers that kind of work together to connect the spiritual realm with the physical world that we live in. And so those 5 layers are, we have our physical body, which has the 5 senses. So you might notice your emotion because you feel like you've been punched in the stomach, or because you've just felt like the blood drain through you, or you might notice it because your heart rate rises, or you might notice like that you've got permanent tension in an area of your body, or you suddenly feel relaxed. So that's a first way that you can notice emotion. It doesn't all have to be naming and sort of heady initially. You might notice it through the digestive system, which can be that we suddenly, our tummy will start bubbling, we'll belch, we might have wind, we might need to go to the loo a bit. And we just think, oh, that's just my body. But sometimes when we try to get in touch with our emotions, it can be through that sensory system. Other times it might be that a memory will come, a visual image will come. It can even be that we suddenly get reminded of a smell. Music is another one,
music really does that.
So that's the first level of noticing, is like, notice what's going on in the physical body. And then we have to try and convert those sensory systems into, what is that emotionally? And we can't really say what that is emotionally unless we have an emotional language.
Yeah.
So I really recommend The Language of Emotions. I can't remember the author's name. I know her surname's McLaren, but I can send it to you afterwards.
I'll link that in the show notes as well. Yeah, sure.
So that's when we're trying to kind of get a little bit more subtle. Then we can begin to notice our mind, and our mind is kind of where we store all our stories, all our meanings, all our strategies. And it's not necessarily in our conscious mind. You know, so often the way we respond to something is more of a reaction, and it's based on our past models.
Yeah.
But we can change those models. But if you haven't acknowledged the root emotion of a situation, it's much more challenging to change that, because emotionally there's still this energetic hook that's like, no, this is still, you know, squeezed or stuck. And then we have our energy body, which some people have experience of, some people don't. If it doesn't resonate for a listener,
it will probably for anyone listening to this.
But at the energetic level, we have kind of our energy system that runs through our physical body, and then we have our energetic field around us as well. And so the way that I personally clear emotions at that level is I use a lot of breath work.
Yeah.
Breath connects our physical body to our mind, but it also clears our energy as well. So I find those techniques work really well for me. I find I tend to steer away from a lot of energy practices just because they can bypass and they mean we don't process, and then it shows up in another level of our being. Yes. So if we, you know, a lot of people say, oh, you've got to do everything at the level of the energy body.
Yeah.
But it's a dynamic system. Like everything flows, like your body, the way your body feels can change the way your emotions, mind, and energy feel. Yeah. But also your being can send messages to update your mind, to update your energy, your mind, your emotions.
Exactly. It's a one thing. It's all together.
So it goes both ways, right?
Yeah.
And there's definitely times when you need to work on multiple layers of the being. Yep. There's definitely times when just working on one is enough, in my opinion, in my lived experience. But I think the big part is kind of recognizing our identity. So often what we call I, when we talk about I in our story, is not our authentic self.
Yeah.
So we might call it the ego, but I feel like ego is attached to all these judgments and like you shouldn't have it. And I don't want anyone to feel that way. I'm like, no, it's your protector, right? It's been born to keep you safe when you didn't feel safe. Yeah. And it's welcome, and it's been set up to save you. And thank goodness you had it, right? But then we have to learn to teach our protector to let go a little bit. But we'll find as we grow and develop, what can sometimes happen is we can have these real visceral responses where we know we want to go after that dream or that goal or that intention, or, you know, whatever it is that you're desiring to create. But the levels in your system aren't in alignment. So mentally, you know where you want to go. In your heart and emotionally, you want to go there. But the body is going, I'm terrified.
Yeah, I'm not doing that. Yeah.
So again, this is a little bit more advanced, but noticing which level of your being is out of alignment, and noticing what you're identifying as me. Because I have this concept that I call the being. Some people might call it your soul. And I believe that our being should be in control, and the messages should come that way through. And then it should be receiving data from the physical body as like a feedback loop, but the body shouldn't be in charge. So often it is. Or our emotions are in charge, and we call it kind of, you know, getting emotionally hijacked. Or our mind is in charge, and we call it rumination. Or our energy is in charge, and you know, it may not, we might feel stuck or blocked, and those sorts of things. So it's the being that can reprogram it all and bring it into alignment so that you're ready to go in the direction you want with less resistance.
Oh, sorry. Less resistant.
Okay.
Yes. It reminds me of a visual when you're explaining that as well, where kind of like when you're operating from like a closed loop system, you're operating like in a circle and you're like staying in that same loop, staying in that same stuck. And then when you expand that out, so when you're talking about this, what it's really bringing to mind is really connecting within as like a powerful step, and you're bringing in so many really beautiful golden nuggets of guidance for people to listen to here. And another one is like, so connecting with yourself, so you know you're not going to know whether you know what layer of being it's connected to or what your best step is if you're not taking that moment and taking that time to go within. So that feels really powerful as well. So it's like the visual moves from like that closed loop system to like you take that like pinpoint and then you're like connecting within, and then all of a sudden there's a spiral in there, and then the spiral can kind of like start to shift stuff. So like energetically, that's what I'm seeing as you're talking about this. You're like you're interrupting the pattern and you're tapping into yourself, and then from there there's the opportunity to receive, you know, more so from above to I call it more so like the observer or my soul self or something like that, same type of thing where that flows down, and again, yeah, then that energy can help you to heal and help you to create those new stories. Do you get like a similar vibe from that, or how does that feel?
I think that's a huge part of it for sure. I think it's part of the story though.
Yeah.
The other part of it is, you know, a big collective um, paradigm or belief system around emotions is that when we have emotions, we should have them alone. We shouldn't share them.
Oh yeah, yeah.
We shouldn't share any emotions that feel constricting to us.
Yeah.
Um, and actually, you know, I love your visual of the closed loop system.
Mm-hmm.
I think that that could be really helpful to draw out for some people,
Yeah.
whatever you saw. Because I think when we're in a constricted space, we're very much in that closed loop circle and there's no new inputs.
Yeah.
And so often we're told, don't share your emotions unless you really, really trust someone, which I agree with.
Yeah.
And it can also feel really dangerous even to share a vulnerable moment, an emotion with someone that you do trust.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, you know, learning to give yourself permission to take tiny steps to share how you truly feel, to let those parts of you that are held in, that are compressed, that aren't allowed to shine out, that you want to be seen but are afraid to let be seen.
Yeah.
You have to do it very gradually in the beginning. Yeah. It's kind of like if you've never been swimming before, you don't want to dive into the deepest pool straight away.
Yep.
You probably want to start by dipping your toe in the water and, you know, going at a pace that works, but it does speed up over time. So it's okay and often helpful or useful to kind of just take it slow in the beginning. But it's about that closed loop is about isolation.
Yeah.
And it's connection that brings you out of any closed loop. So if you're spiraling, if you're stuck, I would say, like, where are you disconnecting and where do you need to be connecting?
Yes. Like simplify. Yeah. It's a very simple, easy way to remember that. Disconnect it, connect it. Like we can all understand that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then just from there. Oh, sorry, keep going.
I was just thinking that there's often, you know, stories that we believe about the way the world works that would prevent us from connecting.
Yeah.
So one of my personal ones, and I always share from mine because I don't want to share necessarily anything from clients. But one of my personal ones was always, you know, I don't have a support system like other people.
Same. Yep. Yeah.
I found it to be quite a common one.
Yeah.
But when we can feel the emotion of the desperation in that, the deep despair of it, the lack of the hopelessness in it, when we can just sit with that and allow it to be, we no longer need to change it. We're no longer fighting with our reality. We're no longer like going again, trying to create a different reality. We can accept it and say, okay, well, if this is the situation, what do I actually need? And that's where we start to move into our empowerment. So that for me was, kind of saying, I need to build my sort of friendship family. I need to work in an environment where I'm going to be supported, where they have great benefits, and where my immediate managers are caring kinds of people. They have those similar values to me.
Yeah.
But so often we end up because we're not taught about this, like not part of our education, unfortunately, we don't necessarily know how to do this stuff.
Yeah.
And we kind of have to teach ourselves bit by bit. And there are people out there who understand it. There's always an argument that, oh, is this going into therapeutic ground? Because I'm not a therapist, so I kind of just think it's useful to say that. I'm not a counsellor either. I am what's called a career development coach in the UK. In the US, it's called a career counsellor, in fact, and we learn the same stuff. But we like to be very technical in the UK for some reason. And for me, I believe that we don't help people with the processing part of what's going on for them, with the emotional processing part so well in coaching, because it's kind of this taboo that it should belong in therapy. And there are absolutely times when certain reactions do need counselling or therapeutic support. But then there are absolutely times when emotions are the thing that will move someone through into their own empowerment simply by acknowledging it. So a great example of this is something I offer people is it's called an emotional resiliency assessment. And there's no good or bad, there's no sort of rights or wrongs, but it's a series of questions that you then sort of say where you sit on a scale, and then we talk about why. And when people do that, they tend to kind of start telling stories, and I'll say, oh, what do you think is behind that? And we'll name the emotion. And I've had clients who, they've not been able to move forward, and it turns out there's a story about, a boss that gave them a really hard time, and they've taken on that story as their identity. And when we let them feel it without judging it, by going to notice it, to thank that emotion for coming up, because it's anything you experience in your emotions is always going to be serving you. It's always got a positive intent, even if it's not quite the right strategy. It's always serving us. So when we thank it, we can't be in a state of judgment, because it's a state of judgment that takes us to the constriction and the darkness that we associate to that illusion of separation.
Or disconnect.
Exactly.
So moving into that state of gratitude, as you express that, thanking the emotion and recognizing the intention behind that emotion. Like, say, for example, if there was like a 3-year-old, like what jumps into my mind, a 3-year-old, and they were like bringing you a glass of orange juice or something like that, and they tripped and they spilled the orange juice. Are you going to freak out at that 3-year-old that, that they made a huge mess in what they're doing? Or are you going to recognize the intention is that they're trying to offer you something, trying to do something good for you? So kind of like almost whenever I'm working with emotion, sometimes I like to look at it as like, just even if it's not coming from a childhood aspect of yourself, but like maybe it was something that happened last week or last month or whenever it is, but also looking at it through the lens of like this sweet little part of yourself, and oh, how sweet, like this is what they're trying to do, like thank you for that. Like it's very much that energy of kind of looking at yourself from a different lens of where that story came from and how you came to that conclusion was just a very natural response based on what you were working with. So it's just kind of like softening that, right?
Yeah, totally. We all have a lot of stories that where we're telling ourselves that we are not divine, not good,
Yeah.
not enough, and so on. And that all comes from those kinds of events. You know, they can be really small. People think trauma is like this huge thing.
Yeah.
Trauma can be the absence of something.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons sometimes people say, well, I don't have any trauma, but I can't connect with my emotions. It's like,
that was me. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's the absence of an experience that was needed for a healthy mindset and system setup.
Yeah.
So if you have parents that don't emotionally attune to you, that don't say, oh, why are you upset? Or what are you thinking? Or what's going on inside you? You don't learn to process.
Yeah.
You know, and this is like this isn't to blame parents or our childhoods, right? This is a calling to our gifts. This is an opportunity, as you say, to notice that really authentic self that was trying to offer this gift of orange juice.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
But that goes into our life stories as well. So this is where I love to work, is kind of whatever the arc of your life story, there's probably going to be some trials and tribulations along the way, and you've attached kind of these constricting stories that have the emotions and thoughts and paradigms and identity attached to it of who you are. But you can always go back to that memory or to that scene and recognize what was your true intention.
Yes. Yeah.
What was the gold or the gift or the divinity or the goodness or the value here? And it's when we can hold that without needing it from the outside. When, you know, as kids, like if you do make an offering like that, and it, you know, often parents are busy,
it does go that way. Yeah.
you know, and sometimes it's not because they're busy. Sometimes, you know, parents aren't quite wired up in the way maybe we'd hope.
Exactly, because they're their own programming too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when we make those offerings, we have a choice, and we don't have this choice as children, but as adults. You know, we can respond like a child, as in, why don't they like me? I don't feel validated. I don't feel like I belong here. I don't feel like I deserve to exist or that I'm valued. And we can go into the emotional pattern and turmoil of that. Or we can say, actually, I'm having this experience right now.
Yeah.
That's how I responded as a child. How do I want to respond now?
Yeah.
But it's really hard, and I had a lot of resistance to this. I didn't want to take responsibility for my life.
Yeah.
I was absolutely against setting goals. I felt like they were a trap. They just didn't work for me in the early stages. And I think that part of that is that we inside are still hoping to change other people, hoping that something outside of us will be different.
Yeah.
And when we learn that that's never going to happen and we let go of that hope, we can move out of hopelessness and say, well, what do I need to create to give myself that desired outcome, that desirable experience in a different
that focus within instead of on the outside. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's like this process of birth and death.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, you have to let go of something. Maybe it's part of your identity. Maybe it's a story. Maybe it's a perspective. In order to, I want to correct myself, not let go. Let be. I like the word let be.
Yeah.
Because let go makes it feel like we've got to get rid of it.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with having it. So I'm like, let it be.
Yeah.
Just completely let it be. And then we can, that opens up the space for new opportunities that we have never seen. So we can cross over from this, you know, constricted world that we're living in into a more empowered world, or from a trauma world into a healthy world. Might be a way that some people phrase it.
So I feel like we could go on forever, but I'm going to wrap up our conversation here and just ask, is there anything else that you do want to share with the audience today before we are wrapping up?
I would just say, if you're at a point where you feel stuck, but you really want to grow or move forward in some way, know that whatever is present for you, whatever that resistance or stuckness is, it's just an old pattern that's trying to keep you safe. And invite that pattern to update. When you set those intentions around when you're frustrated with anything, get it out your system in terms of be really clear what it is that you're trying to move away from, and then change your thinking and say, actually, what do I want to move towards? What's the experience that I'm trying to have here? When we focus on moving towards what we want, we actually get what we want. When we move away from what we don't want to experience or what feels bad or icky, we're not actually setting our course. So that would be my final point. That if you change nothing else and take nothing else from this podcast, take that.
Take that. I love that so much. And where can people go to find you online, Holly?
So people can go to evolving.careers.
Okay.
I'm actually going through a huge identity update myself in my business. So a lot of that talks about leadership. But if you just want to get in touch with me, you can email me at holly@evolving.careers.
Perfect. I'll link that below as well. Yeah.
If you are interested in a free emotional fitness assessment, then anybody that drops me an email and says, I heard you on the Ascension podcast, then I will give you that for free and offer you a 30-minute kind of little talk through what you found through that process as well.
I love that. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. And I'm excited to see where your next business evolution takes you to.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. Get more details about today's guest and get your copy of Catalyst magazine at the link in the show notes below.